Welcome to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Today, I am delighted to introduce Neal Spackman, who is a globally recognized leader in regenerative land development and design. He was co-founder of Regenerative Resources, a company focused on blue economy and blue ecosystem restoration, and co-founder of the Baydha Project, where he partnered with semi-nomadic tribes to reverse desertification in Mecca. Spackman was a Food Shot Prize finalist in 2024 and an Earthshot Prize nominee in 2023. He's an alumni of Stanford's Graduate School of Business, where he was awarded a Tomcat Center Sustainability Innovation Fellowship. His current project, Raft, is dedicated to regenerative aquaforestry with a particular focus on sustainable shrimp farming and mangrove regeneration. Neal, I'm so glad to have you with us today. Thanks so much for being with us. Welcome.
Thanks, Mira. Thanks for the invitation.
So you've been around. You've done a lot of things and some very, very exciting things. The introduction that I had to you initially was around this regeneration of the desert. And you created a miracle there. And in collaboration with nature, obviously, but I'd love it if you talk a little bit about that and then how it led to where you are currently and your current involvement with Raft.
Yeah. The Baydha Project was run and funded by Princess Haifa Al Faisal, who's the youngest daughter of the late King Faisal, and other members of her family. And initially, their vision was to establish what we thought of as a green village, with a focus on sustainability around economy and ecology. Her vision was very broad. I mean, we did things with housing, we did things with infrastructure. Because of her efforts, these communities we worked with, about 45 kilometers south of Mecca, got their first paved roads. They got satellite connection for their phones. They got electricity lines delivered out to these villages. And my role there was to work directly with the people and figure out a way to bring productivity back to the land.
Now, just to be clear, these villages are in the desert, right? It's really bleak, barren, right? Or it was.
They tend to be organized by family groups and tribal groups, and so you'll have settlements of between 5 and 50 houses kind of dotting the landscape. Once the road came through, people tried to get closer to the road, but they're people who they have a lot of identity and a lot of culture built up around that land. They've been there for essentially forever. So all their poetry references the landscape they live in. All their stories, reference this particular landscape. So they're people that belong to this land. And yeah, they starting probably 100 years ago, there started to be a trend towards settling and a trend away from being nomads. Although as recently as 2007 or 2008, there were still folks out there living in goat hair tents and moving around every couple weeks or every couple months, right? So very, very traditional nomadic folks, dealing with the upheaval of globalization and modernization, and the same things we're all dealing with, but they're coming from a very different place than most of us.
But also the degradation of the land too,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
they're nomadic. So how are they surviving on the land?
Well, they're not anymore, and that was half of the point. Was that this region had seen so much deforestation and desertification in the last 60, 70 years that they weren't making a living on the land anymore. And most of the families were reliant on government welfare payments that they would use to buy imported feed for their animals.
Mm.
A lot of the youth were going up to Mecca to try to find jobs. And so you had that same rural to urban migration dynamic that we see all over the world. And at the same time, a lot of hesitancy to fully embrace urbanism because of their pastoral culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in this massive transitionary phase where they're trying to hang on to identity and culture, and at the same time dealing with the reality of degraded land and unproductive land, and having to make a living and take care of themselves. So that's kind of the socio-cultural context.
Were they dependent on animals essentially, right?
Oh yeah.
So it's goats, sheep, what are their
Goat,
animals?
sheep, and camels.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Goat, sheep, and camels. Almost every family there has 20 or 30 goats or sheep. Some have a few more. Most families have one or two camels. A few of the families have more. They have a couple dozen camels. And it's kind of the preference. Some people really love camels, and others really love sheep, and others really like goats. And there's of course there's a lot of cultural prestige in camels, and a lot of cachet, let's say. But
Interesting. What do you do with a couple dozen camels?
well, you milk them.
Really?
Oh yeah, you milk them, and beyond that, they're also both a storage of wealth and a status of wealth.
Hmm.
Right? Like you if you're a nomad 300 years ago, you don't count your wealth by what's in the bank. It's the number of head you've got. Right? But they will eat a camel every now and then on special occasions. But the sheep and goats are more for eating and for wool. The camels are more for milking and for status and wealth kind of storage.
It's interesting now that you're saying that. I read somewhere that camel milk is supposed to be really, really, really healthy that it helps heal all kinds of things. Do you know anything about that?
That's the rumor. I mean, it's sweeter than cow's milk, it's grassier than cow's milk, and it's less fatty than cow's milk. But I don't think it's any kind of miracle food, but I like it, and it's healthy. It's a major source of protein for most of the kids in those communities.
Interesting.
And I would say, rather than its therapeutic properties, I think the advantage of camels is they can be in very, very harsh conditions and still provide a very high quality source of protein for kids in those areas, right? And for adults for that matter. Their adaptability to desert climates is really quite amazing. But I was with these communities for the better part of a decade, and started with 100-acre watershed. We had mountains and we had a dry river valley called a wadi. We had a little bit of a floodplain. So we had a geographic fractal of the whole region that the governor and the tribes allocated to us to work with. And they said, okay, you can go figure things out over there. And we had an original team of 15 men who began working with me, who were taken from 3 different tribes. And that team grew to a team of about 120 people over the course of 3 or 4 years. And then we ran those teams in a number of different projects, some of which were focused on watershed management, flash flood management. So a lot of building of physical structures to slow water down in the mountains.
Let me just ask you a question. This is in an area where there's very little rainfall, right?
That's right.
So when
we average less than 2 inches a year.
Say it again.
About 2 inches a year is the average. What that translates to, though, is you'll go 2 or sometimes 3 years with no rain at all, and then you'll get 3 inches in a day and 2.5 inches in another day. Like, averages don't mean much in the desert. It's very intermittent. It's quite unpredictable. And
the notion of flash flooding, when you're talking about an area that's so dry, what causes that? What's the dynamic around that?
Yeah, I mean, all deserts flood. Generally because there's nothing in the landscape to slow it down, right? When you get rain in a green area, the effect that plants have on the flow of water is dramatic. And so when you have rocky mountains and kind of clayey, sandy landscape, the water will just it flash floods. That's what it does. Every desert is like that, right? And so you get this drought flood cycle where you go long periods of time with no water, and then the water you do get, it's a very destructive and dangerous kind of event. And so there are families in that area who have lost children or grandparents or animals to flash floods.
Wow.
Where they die in them. And so that is the general dynamic that you expect when you're in the desert, is a drought flood cycle.
And so your strategy for this was to slow the water down so that it could actually penetrate the soil, yes?
Yeah. Physically first and biologically second was that you had to, I mean, it's really easy to pump water out of the ground and drain your aquifer to grow stuff in the desert. That's what most people in deserts are doing right now. Our objective was increase the groundwater while increasing, the vegetative coverage, with an eye to establishing an agroforestry system that would have significant economic benefits for the people there. Right. So it wasn't just bring life back and get conservation going. It was bring life back in a way that it supports people and planet.
To renew a culture, really.
Yeah.
So this is very interesting. You talked about that there were several people from several tribes. What's the social relationship between these tribes? Were they adversarial? Were they did collaborative? How do they relate to
I mean, they intermarry, so they're friendly with each other. Um, anytime there's a conflict, though, the tribal lines become very solid.
Mm,
But in general, yeah, they're friendly with each other. They intermarry. They cooperate on all sorts of things. Some of that is just, I think, being in a rural setting. Some of that is just Bedu culture, where they tend to be unflappingly polite and hospitable to guests. And some of it, I think, was just they're all going through the same situation,
mhm.
right? So there were only a couple instances of tribal conflict that I witnessed, and they weren't too dramatic.
Did you
Uh,
find that the project deepened bonds between people overall, or?
yeah, definitely. Just because for most of them, this was the first paid job that they had. Like it was culture shock for them to come and work with me. Because we set up rules and regulations and patterns. Most of them didn't have a bank account, so I'd pay them at the end of the month in cash. And so we had to create practices and rules and patterns that they weren't familiar with in that whole setting. But then it was just time spent together working on a thing.
Mhm.
That as time passed, I think trust deepened and friendships deepened, because that's what happens when you're all working together towards a common objective. um
When
so
we
there
talked
was,
when we talked previously, you mentioned something that's sort of a cultural phenomenon called baseline shift or something along that line.
yeah.
What is it called?
Shifting baseline, I don't know if it's not a syndrome, but it I think people do call it syndrome, but it's the idea that as landscapes change, different generations assume that what they're used to in that landscape is how it's always been, or they assume it's normal, right? So for instance, uh prior to the deforestation of this region, and it would be the grandpas of the old folks who are there now. So I worked with a bunch of folks who are now in their 60s and 70s. Their grandfathers would have had a much more lush landscape that they were interacting with. And they had dryland forests that when they were green, you couldn't look across the valley and see the mountains on the other side, right? And they reliably had a winter rain and a summer rain. So it used to rain twice a year, quite, kind of like clockwork. And so when it would rain, they would get 3 to 4 months of grasses, and then those would be gone, and they'd graze on trees for 3 to 4 months, and then it would rain again, and so they had this kind of cyclical interaction with trees and grasses and the rainfall uh, that had persisted for a very long time,
What
right?
destroyed it?
The In the 1950s, Saudi Arabia went on a major kick to diminish the influence of tribalism as a way to try to grow, as a way to foment kind of national sentiment, because they were building a nation state. And as part of that effort, there was a decree in 1952 that abolished the traditional tribal boundaries. And when that happened, the traditional land management system also kind of collapsed. That system was called HIMA, which means protection in Arabic. The HIMA system predates Islam. It goes back to at least 2000 BC. And that system had maintained the fertility of landscapes in Arabia for thousands of years, right? And it was a very harsh system of rules and ways to manage land, but it did maintain productivity of the land. Now, when I say productivity, this is still like a desert landscape primarily, but they did have dryland forests. They did have some wetlands. They had a lot of perennial springs that would come out of these mountains. But when that system was abolished, so was all the things that had kept that landscape whole. And so since the 1950s, there's been severe deforestation and desertification because of the unintended consequences of a legal ruling that eliminated the HIMA.
What kinds of practices? You said there were harsh rules.
Yeah. I mean, a tribe would break up their lands and they'd say this area is for, beekeeping during the winter months and you can't ever graze it. And this area is for, the warriors' horses, right? And this area is for the tribal leaders' camels, and that area is for these families. And if you trespassed those boundaries, right? If you brought sheep or goats or whatever where they weren't supposed to be, you would lose a percentage of your flock was confiscated and you were flogged.
Oh, wow.
Right? Like it was tightly managed across very large landscapes. Right. And of course, as all tribal societies do, there were, wars over expansionism, and there were attempts at stealing and all kinds of things that tend to accompany tribal pastoral societies, right? Same patterns, only a pretty unforgiving landscape. And all of that was gone in the 50s. Now anybody can graze anything at any time. Right.
So was any of this reinstituted as you were rehabilitating the?
No, it's still kingdom-wide, it's still a major issue. I mean, free grazing camels are a major cause of desertification and deforestation around the country.
Interesting.
And so what we did was we took this small 100-acre watershed and we fenced it off. And we said, okay, we're going to create a system that shows that we can bring this back, and provide an economy. And just pretend that it's not our job to deal with the legal issues of how you would establish this at scale, right? That's way beyond my paycheck. What we did was we showed it was possible ecologically and pointed the way economically at how you could bring millions and millions of hectares of landscape back to life.
So I want to go back to the shifting baseline syndrome for a second.
Yeah.
Because you had said when we spoke earlier that one of the biggest hurdles that you encountered was the belief that it was even possible. That because they saw a desert, they didn't see the potential for greenery there.
Yeah.
So how did you address that?
We just built it.
You just
I mean, the people that worked with me, the Bedouin, thought we were crazy for building dams in the mountains. Right. And we did we did this by hand, using local stone. And this is generally called natural infrastructure or green infrastructure, but these were small stone structures to hold water and to slow down flash floods, right? And when we started out, they were just like, this is crazy, but I'm getting a paycheck, so I'll do it.
Okay.
That's fine. It took a few years for the results of that work to show up because it only rained so often. But once they saw the mountain turn greener, then they were like, oh, okay, we get it now. But it took a couple of years for them to really trust me. But that, yeah, I mean, we had the tenure of the land with the governorates and the tribal permission, right? We had a budget to hire a small team and go out and start prototyping and building this stuff. And then the results started to speak for themselves.
I'm wondering if you might share photos with us that we can put on our website.
Sure. Yeah,
So we'll put them at sustainabilitynow.global, but the transformation is magical.
yeah,
It's really quite extraordinary.
yeah.
So you said you employed a number of different tactics to
Mhm.
slow down the water. One you just were speaking about was dams.
Yeah.
What else did you do?
I mean, there's a suite of earthworks that have been used for this kind of thing around the world. The ones that we did the most of are called check dams, which are kind of like leaky weirs. But we also experimented with Zuni bowls and Zai holes and gabions and swales, one rock dams, berms and basins. And all of these things are just physical structures that change how the land interacts with water.
You
Right.
could be writing a new dictionary.
No,
I
I mean, this is all standard stuff in my world. It's all like, they're all like known things. It was
Okay.
just a question of which ones are the best for this kind of landscape, given the tools that we have and the resources that we have. And I mean, these kinds of things have been done in China and Uganda and Pakistan and Mexico and in the southwestern US. I mean, there's a suite of tools that people who do this kind of work tend to use, right? And I was familiar enough with them and had a couple folks on hand very early on that kind of guided me. The most well known of those is a gentleman named Brad Lancaster, who wrote a series of books actually called Rainwater Harvesting for Dry Lands.
Great. We're going to list that on our website also.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal set of books that teach all these structures and where they should be applied and the pitfalls of building them. Brad lives in Tucson, and he actually got the city of Tucson to change how they do cityscaping. He changed the entire topography and hydrology of Tucson cityscape by redesigning curbs and roundabouts to beneficially interact with water, right?
Wow.
So he's done a lot with the urban watershed, but he's also done a lot with rural watersheds. And then for me, I kind of looked to the Nabateans, who are an ancient civilization in Jordan and northern Arabia, who were master water managers. I did a lot of study of their water systems as well as of the Incas, and between those three different things, that's what I was basing our work on. And so we built these structures in the mountains and in the floodplain, and then measured how much water we were able to catch. And then the beauty of these structures is they start out just physically slowing down water, but they also catch silt that's eroding down the mountain. And then that starts to form these areas that collect water and hold water and retain it, and then they become planting platforms for reforestation. So they start out as water catchment and end up being platforms for forestry.
And so you actually did reforestation, you actually did planting as well as the
Yeah.
water capture.
Yeah, there were about a dozen different tree species that we trialed that I anticipated that they would either have a strong grazing benefit in terms of tree hay, or that they would produce something else that could become a sellable good. So a grazing based agroforestry, which is called silvopasture. Right. So we were aiming at creating a silvopasture through flash flood management, and the results are, out of those dozen or so trees, there's really 5 that worked well, that withstood drought after we took off the irrigation, and that have strong potential for a very successful agroforestry system. The 5 together produce a lot of grazing material, so the people can do their goats and their camels and their sheep. Although sheep tend to not like tree leaves, they tend to like grass more. So camels and goats more so. But then there were a couple oils we were able to produce off of these trees that have very strong markets. A couple fruits that also have strong markets locally that they'd be able to sell into. And then all of it together is also very conducive to beekeeping. And so off of this system, if we were to do a large scale version, right, across thousands of hectares, you'd have your beekeeping with your honey and your wax and your other bee products. You'd have your milk and your meat and your wool off of your grazing animals. And then you'd have a couple niche products that you could either sell or export, one of which is a cosmetics input and ingredient, the other of which is a fruit that's locally bought and sold.
What's the cosmetics ingredient?
It's a moringa oil.
Huh. Interesting.
Moringa is primarily known as an African tree, and usually sold for the leaves. The leaves are incredibly nutrient dense. There are moringa products on most grocery store shelves in the US. But the oil that's pressed from the seeds is used in a variety of skincare and hair care products.
Interesting.
It sells for something like $80 a liter.
Wow.
It's a high value, high margin kind of crop. And we were able to get a local moringa species to fruit in our system.
Wow. Wow. So now this project you worked on it for 8 or 9 years?
Yeah.
What did you see in terms of the transformation of the economy and the social structures there, in addition to the greening of the desert?
So there is no intent to change the social structures. We were trying to work within the existing social structures. So no transformation there beyond trends that were already happening independent of us. The economy, again, we only got this on a 100-acre site. And so it's more like we built the proof of concept, and we built the system that shows the way forward if you were going to do this large scale, right? Mm-hmm. But we were prototyping, right? It's kind of like with Edison, who went through I don't know how many hundreds of versions of his light bulb, right? He got one working, and that was the thing. we did that, right? Like we built the light bulb, but we haven't commercialized it yet.
Got it.
We just proved that it's real and that it works.
Yeah.
But expansion of that system to a point where it's economically, financially viable and uplifting communities is was beyond the scope of what we were doing. We did try to expand onto a 5,000 acre watershed, and found that there were significant barriers to doing so, political barriers. And so that's a big reason why I left when I did, is because we said, okay, we've built the proof of concept, we know it works. And now it's going to be up to the ministries and the powers that be to build on this.
Can you say something about what the political obstructions were?
Very, very standard stuff, right? Anytime you're talking land and water, you're going to get stuck in very, very local politics. And in KSA, you've kind of got two layers to contend with. There's the legal and government layer, where certain boundaries are demarcated for different purposes and for different ministries. But then you have the local layer and the traditional layer of tribes who've been on a particular piece of land for a long, long time and have, a stone berm that's 300 years old that marks an old boundary, but that isn't recognized by the government anymore, but is respected by the local people, right? And you combine those two things and try to go do something big, and it becomes very difficult very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting factor in our working with the planet.
Yeah.
Is the human structures, human.
Oh yeah, they're critical.
And I guess
they're more difficult than the natural systems.
Exactly. So I think that's an interesting question of social engineering, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Look at how to mitigate that kind of impediment.
Oh, well, it's I think it's just part of the work, right? Anytime you want to do large scale land restoration, you've got to work through the existing power structures and get the approvals and the permits and the tenure. And at the same time, build trust with local communities so that they're not threatened by the work you're doing.
And so maybe the local communities can pressure or influence the governmental structure.
Potentially, I mean, but bottom up and top down
Yeah.
are both necessary most of the time. I think if you only try to go bottom up, it's a long, long time to success and often just gets squashed. If you only go top down, you end up being neo-colonial, right? And you end up displacing people and causing, in that you get the genesis of the failure of your project, right? You see the own failure of your project if you don't work with local people. So in my experience, you have to be able to do both.
And so do you have a vision for how that might be addressed there? I mean, I understand top down, bottom up, that's a vision, but even more specifically, because I think that this is the crisis of our time, that we have this knowledge available to us about how to regreen the desert, for example, and what's in the way is our human bureaucracies and social structures.
So oftentimes that's the case, but in KSA, they've launched a very large project called the Saudi Green Initiative that aims to do exactly what you're talking about. And it's led by a few different government entities, but it's very ambitious. It's part of their carbon neutrality pledge. Saudi Arabia's pledged to be carbon neutral by, I believe, 2060 as a country.
Wow.
And this is part of their effort at that.
It's a big deal coming from an oil country.
It really is. It really is. So I think in that broader objective, and they're talking about tens of millions of hectares of land that they want to regreen. Al Baydha is a proof of concept for that whole endeavor, right? And it's so I mean it's the role that I had in that, I think in the Al Baydha project was significant, but the role in the Green Saudi initiative, it's Saudi led, going to be Saudi executed, and that's for the best in my opinion. But what we did was we showed it's possible to do it.
That's the first thing.
Yeah.
It's the first, what is it?
Yeah.
Is it 3 or 4 minute mile? Whatever, once that barrier's broken, then
lots of people start being able to do it.
Because you've brought it into the realm of the possible.
I think it used to be the 4-minute mile, and now I think it's the 3-minute mile.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I want to give some time to your more recent endeavor. You decided to leave when the politics got crazy. And so now talk about the transition, if you would.
Well, so I left Al Baydha and I went to Stanford. And I had been, and I mean, in those 8 years, pretty much all I did was dwell on, the process. How do we reverse degradation, right? Not just deserts, but we've lost or destroyed huge amounts of ecologies and ecosystems. I think it's 70% of Earth's land is degraded, primarily by agriculture, but other systems as well.
Not to mention the oceans and waterways.
Yeah, and oceans, the numbers around oceans are really horrific. We've lost 50% of the world's mangroves, 50% of the world's seagrasses in the last 70 years. And coral reefs, the numbers I see are between 30 and 50%, and 70% are, in danger of, bleaching and severe degradation, right? And these are the foundation of life on the planet. They're the foundations of our lives, right? And our societies and our civilizations. And so running Al Baydha as a nonprofit in Saudi Arabia was in some ways amazing compared to work I've tried to do since, because once we had the governor's approval, through and that happened through Princess Haifa. I mean, Princess Haifa created this umbrella and the opportunity for the innovation that we did. If it weren't for her, it would have been impossible, right? But then once we were on the ground, I had no red tape. She said, if you think it's gonna work, do it small first, so that if we fail, we're failing small. And then whatever works, we'll build on that, which is on her part just a tremendous openness to risk while being able to provide that cover for innovation, right? Like that, I've never seen that kind of openness to failure and just an acceptance of that process as I have there, right? But it was a nonprofit project, right? And globally, 1% of philanthropy goes to environmental causes. right? And
That's
the total,
that is a horrifying statistic in and of
it's
itself.
true. It's true. And the total amount of philanthropy globally is, I think a couple $100 billion is how much philanthropy gets, spread around every year, and less than 1% to the environment. Whereas there's $6 trillion sloshing around capital markets looking for places to land. Right. So my point in going to Stanford Business School was, how do I create a way to attract the investment capital into this rather than seeing all of this just happening via philanthropy? Because if it's only ever the philanthropic funds, we're never gonna get anywhere with it. Right? Yeah. We can set up conservation. And I look at there's the 30 by 30 endeavor right now where they're saying we need 30% of the world in conservation. Does that mean we're going to destroy the other 70%?
It's such backward thinking. I mean,
because that is what we're doing, right? We've decimated ecosystems and the foundation of life on the planet.
That's crazy.
And so my objective was, how do I find a way to do this for profit so that the impact can be that much bigger?
Yeah.
Right? Because if it's only ever philanthropy, it's never going to be big enough.
Right.
And I was not a businessman. I did not have entrepreneurial experience, although I did have a lot of experience in R&D and prototyping and building things that people didn't know could be built. So that's why I went to Stanford, and I spent a year at Stanford, got a degree, and ended up incubating regenerative resources there. And regenerative.
Wait. Yeah, I'm sorry. You were going to say. I was going to say, what does that mean?
Yeah, Regenerative Resources was a startup that I founded with 5 other co-founders, who were primarily pioneers of something called seawater agriculture. And seawater agriculture was the modern version of this was invented by a scientist named Carl Hodges, who was a pioneer of greenhouse agricultural systems and also a pioneer in aquaculture systems. And in the early 1970s, he was at University of Arizona's Environmental Research Lab working with aquaculture systems. And he was like, what do we do with all the wastewater here? And if we're going to run out of fresh water, what can we do with seawater? And so he identified a number of plants that are originally from coastlines and figured out that if they were domesticated, they could become crops for key markets related to food security. And the one he picked to start with was called Salicornia, which is also known as sea beans or sea asparagus. Every now and then it shows up at fancy restaurants in the US. But he started breeding and growing Salicornia as a crop with seawater as his source of water. And that the no desalination, no treatment, just plain seawater. He would pump it into the desert, irrigate this plant with it, and grow it as a crop.
Wow.
And then sometime in there, he learned that if he integrated it with aquaculture systems, he could solve 2 problems at once. Aquaculture is one of their main problem is wastewater, right?
Aquaculture being fish farming.
Fish farming. Fish, shrimp, shellfish, it all counts as aquaculture. But most aquacultures have huge problems with wastewater. And most aquaculture farmers dump that waste into the ocean and cause really big problems. Well, he figured out he could use that wastewater as fertilizer to grow his Salicornia crops, right? And then he doesn't have to buy fertilizer for his crops, and he solves the wastewater problem of the aquaculture.
So
And that turned
creating a circular system.
exactly. And that they had 20 years of prototyping this system in Bayaquino in Sonora, Mexico. And his major partner in this was a fellow named Ned Doherty, who is my partner currently, right? Ned worked with Carl starting in the mid-70s. And my other partner, Howard Weiss, also worked very closely with Carl for decades. And so they started developing this circular seawater agriculture system, and they named it ISIS in the early 90s, integrated seawater agricultural systems. And ISIS, they're the pioneers of this whole thing. They're the inventors of this whole thing. And after 30 years of prototyping and breeding and figuring stuff out, they had an opportunity to go and build a commercial farm in Eritrea, which is in East Africa. And if you go to YouTube and look up greening Eritrea, you'll find a video about that project. It ran for 5 years. They were producing multiple tons of food and feed and all kinds of things by building an artificial river that when it was high tide, seawater would flood into the desert.
Wow.
And they would grow tilapia and shrimp on it, and then fertilize their agricultural fields with that fertilized salt water, right? They were exporting multiple tons of shrimp and fish to the EU. They fed hundreds of camels of local people, where they just gave away animal fodder grown on seawater.
Wow.
Right? And that project ended when the Eritrean government evicted every foreign NGO and every foreign company as I think it was the aftermath of the civil war they had and kind of an abrupt change in policy, to put it in a nice way. But they were forced to abandon that project. It stopped operating within 30, 50 days. Then they went to Egypt. They did a large feasibility study for a 150,000 acre project.
Wow.
Spent 3 years doing the feasibility, doing the master planning, doing the land surveys, working with the proper authorities, getting the right approvals, finding the right local partners. And in December of 2010, this project was approved by President Hosni Mubarak. It was I think a $600 million project for the phase 1.
Wow.
And 100 days later, Mubarak was ousted as president in the Arab Spring, and it never happened. Right? If that project were alive and going today, it would have reduced Egypt's fodder imports. Just talking about the animal fodder they could have grown, would have reduced their animal fodder imports by 30%.
That's dramatic.
You're talking about millions and millions of tons of fodder being produced without using any fresh water to do it.
That's extraordinary.
Right? But it never happened. Mubarak was ousted and his projects were shelved. And so through the Stanford Tomcat Center, actually, I met Ned and Howard and my other co-founders who founded Regenerative Resources with us. And I was very privileged to meet with Carl a handful of times before he passed away in 2021. So Carl, if you look up Carl, there's actually a Vanity Fair profile of him from 2007.
Will you say Carl's last name again, please?
Hodges, Carl Hodges. They
Okay.
called him the farmer of the future, and they talked about the seawater agriculture system. So when I met these guys at Stanford and I wrapped my head around what they had done, I said, this is the thing I'm gonna do. This is what I want to do. I want to bring this to life. I want to commercialize it. And you know, solve all these big problems that this system can solve. And so we founded a company called Regenerative Resources. And we started off, we changed the business model they'd had in Eritrea and Egypt. In Eritrea and Egypt, they were really focused on biofuels, which they have produced. The Etihad Airways flew a jet on Salicornia oil from Dubai to Ankara a few years ago. Right?
Wow.
Oil is one of the things this seed oil that you compress from Salicornia is one of the things we can produce. And it was refined into jet fuel and flew a jet to Turkey from the UAE. But the business model being built around biofuels didn't make any sense to me. And so we put our heads together and tried to figure out a different business model and came up with one that was on a project basis and kind of real estate based, where we said we can go and get land that no one else sees any value in, right, along coastal areas, and totally transform them, right? We can we can build our farms, we can produce all this stuff, that'll get sold. But then on top of that, you could build all kinds of industries in an area that used to be totally desolate and is now lush and green. People will want to be there, right? So on top of that transformation, we could stack tourism of various types. We could stack all kinds of things. And so we tried to get a project going in Mexico similar to the Egyptian model, but with different financial anchors, a lot more political stability, and a lot more proximity to American markets, and tried to fund that for 3 years, and failed to do so. And lots of reasons for why that failed, but fundamentally, we were unable to pull it off. And we put the deal together. We got the rights to purchase. We got special permits from the Mexican government. We got letters of intent to purchase what we were going to produce. We had a deal with a local grazing co-op to supply them with seawater-based fodder, and to move their cheeses into the US. Like we had lots of deals put together. We had lots of things. The land was the security, so that there was an inherent value in whatever investor put in, but we couldn't get it done. We weren't able to do it.
So where is it now? What's happening with it now?
Nothing. It's on the shelf. And when that failed, we kind of did a last gasp effort to do something similar in the UAE, which was last year. Weren't able to make that happen, and then we shut down Regenerative Resources. And some of us have tried to figure out, okay, what are all the mistakes we've made in the last 4 years, and how do we put something together that someone will say yes to, right? I'm still a big believer in that real estate play, that it's a distressed assets play, and based on the transformation of the land, which I have a lot of experience doing. But it may have to come later. It may have to come down the road.
So what's happening with Raft? How did Raft emerge?
The Raft is a response to that failure to fund this on a project basis. Raft is fundamentally an aquaculture technology company, which builds on the same system, builds on, the collective intellectual property that our co-founders have, but it's a fundamentally different business and different business model, where it's targeted at one particular market, targeted at the comparative advantages that we can get in that market, and really narrows the scope. It narrows the scope significantly. Under regenerative resources, we were doing carbon development, we were doing land development, we were doing restoration, and we were also doing consulting, right? 3 of those were just to pay the bills, right? 3 of those were to keep the lights on while we were trying to fund that project. But it ended up being too unwieldy. And so Raft is my kind of lessons learned from that whole 4 years, and the next attempt at something that I think will be able to bring this whole seawater ag industry, to out of infancy and into a growth stage.
So what you're doing is you're farming shrimp and using waste from the shrimp to restore mangrove.
No, it's to grow a mangrove agroecology.
Okay.
And it's not that we're the ones growing shrimp, although we will have at least one farm. It's more that we're building the technology and the systems for other farmers to transform their farms, right? We see this as a technology play where we're going to be licensing a system to other farmers. And
Okay.
our primary revenues will be royalties.
Okay.
Right.
Now, shrimp farming, maybe you can just illuminate that a little bit for us.
Yeah. Shrimp farming is a deeply unsustainable industry. It's a 40 billion a year industry, and it's growing incredibly fast. We farm more shrimp than we take out of the ocean now. Right. So global shrimp market is in 2022 is 70 billion. 40 of that is farmed. 30 of it is wild caught. And
where is shrimp farmed?
In coastal areas around the globe. The largest producer is Ecuador.
Okay.
But then China, India, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico are all large producers. There are a few farms in the US. There used to be more. And there's significant interest in establishing large-scale aquacultures around Africa and the MENA region.
Meantime, you said it's really destructive. In what way?
Both in terms of the supply chain and in terms of waste. The inputs to fish farming, or shrimp farming rather, tend to be bycatch, which is bycatch is when fishermen pull in fish and they get, a percentage of the kind of fish they're looking for and a percentage of everything else. That everything else is called bycatch. And it gets ground up and processed into fish meal and fish oil, right? And the way we catch bycatch tends to be from trawling, right? And trawling also, it's super destructive.
It's nets, dragging nets.
It's dragging heavy weights across the benthic region of the ocean. It destroys the ecosystem of the ocean floor, is what it does. And they're looking for a particular fish that has a particular market, and then the bycatch is everything else. And they're like, well, we caught it. Let's just
ecosystems.
Yeah. Let's just grind it up and we'll sell it to the aquaculture industry.
Got it.
And so that piece of the supply chain is deeply unsustainable. But then the rest of the feed that tends to go to shrimp tends to be soybeans and wheat paste or corn byproducts. which are monocropped and are creating dead zones in the ocean, right? You look at all the ag runoff.
Highly chemical laden and genetically engineered. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a deep irony that we're destroying the ocean in order to farm shrimp.
Yeah.
Right. And most other aquaculture, most other farmed fish as well, right? Whether it's through, and that's just a supply chain. Then the other piece of it is, in most of the world, farmers grow shrimp in ponds and they just dump their wastewater in the ocean, which causes algae blooms and fish kills. But they're polluting their own water source. So they also tend to end up pumping that dirty water back into their farm. And then that necessitates the use of antibiotics and other inputs that we don't want in our food. So it's a critical industry for feeding people, right? We're producing 40 billion a year worth of shrimp in this manner. And most of the innovation, most of the technology development in this industry goes towards high-tech methods of growing, where they're using, very expensive filters to clean the water in recirculating systems. They're looking for ways to process it. It's a tremendously fast-paced and innovative kind of world, is the aquaculture world. But there are significant ways where our tech disrupts this industry.
Can you give us some clues?
Yeah, I mean, the one is that wastewater for everybody else is a cost, a significant cost sometimes. For us, it's a profit center.
So say more about that. Because
Well,
what you're talking about is making it circular. So.
Yeah, but so for the pond farmers who are dumping it in the ocean, they're not even to go into the negative environmental and social impact of that, right? Like, it damages fisheries, it damages the health of the ocean. But it also increases their own costs, because when they pump dirty water back into their farm, the shrimp aren't as healthy. So it increases mortality, it increases disease rates, it increases the need to buy medicines and antibiotics. It's all a cost.
Yeah.
Right? For us, it makes money.
So
because we use it to grow crops that have key roles to play in food security.
So you said you're not really farming the shrimp. You're using your technology for people that already have shrimp farms. So the technology is in the collection of the wastewater that you're doing?
That's one layer of it. The other layer is we're working with a remarkably smart woman named Paola Magallon, who has 20 years experience in aquaculture R&D. So the project in Mexico that we tried to do failed, but we met our team there. Right, there's some brilliant Mexican researchers and scientists that we are working with in Raft, who have a shrimp growing technology that's 50 times more efficient in land use than a typical pond. Right, so in a typical pond, a farmer will grow between 0.5 ton to 1.5 tons of shrimp per hectare. In the tech that we have, we can, and that's per cycle. There's a number of cycles you can do in a given year, depending on where you are on the planet. But with the tech that our partners have developed, and that is part of Raft, we can do 30 to 50 tons per cycle per hectare.
How do you accomplish something like that?
It's just good science. This system is called it's a proprietary biofloc. Biofloc is kind of like a microbial broth that makes the shrimp feel very relaxed and very pleasant, and it makes them grow fast, creating water that is really in tune with the microbiome of shrimp.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so there's no antibiotics used in this. It's you get all kinds of advantages. But the biggest one for us is that you can do 50 times more shrimp in a hectare of land. And so typically those systems, biofloc systems, tend to be built not in coastal areas, but in cities, where they're right next to the market. They still have a wastewater problem then.
I was going to say, does it generate 50 times the waste?
It does.
And so then,
Well, if you're doing it in a city, then you've got to filter it or you've got to treat it. If you're doing it on a retrofitted shrimp farm, then you can take 10% of the farm and produce more shrimp and transform the other 90% into a mangrove agroecology that's there to absorb the waste and grow a whole lot more stuff.
brilliant.
So that's the idea, is that we can make the farmers a lot more profitable.
And then the product of the mangrove is fodder.
It's varied. Fodder is one of the key ones we want to do in places like the Middle East, because they import 100% of their fodder for their dairy and meat industries, right? So the fact that we can start to grow it domestically is a very big deal. But Middle East, areas of West and East Africa, that's a key thing we can produce. But we can also produce, in a mangrove agroecology, we can produce crab and lobster. We can produce aquaculture feed ingredients, which makes the whole system more circular. We can produce tannins. We can produce ingredients for chicken feed and pet food, and we can produce a whole lot of things. What we inevitably will end up doing is going to be context specific, right? If all of our clients are in Mexico, then we're going to focus on stuff that's appropriate for Mexican markets. If we're working with Ecuadorian farmers, then we're going to tailor it to what maximizes both the ecosystem services of that system and the profitability of that system.
So would you do me a favor and define mangrove?
Mangroves are the roots of the ocean. They are trees that grow in coastal areas in salt water. And they tend to grow very well in deltas, where you've got brackish water, right? You've got that interplay of rivers running into the ocean and the estuaries. In those places, mangroves grow very big, and they're mangrove forests. So the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, for instance, are the largest mangrove forest in the world. It's where the Bengal tiger lives. They are some of the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet, because they inhabit that edge between the land and the water.
So I have to ask, with the waste that you're taking from the shrimp, putting in the mangrove forest to use as fertilizer, how is it contained so it doesn't go to the ocean and pollute? Like, how does it get retained?
There's a ratio there. There's a ratio there of hectares of aquaculture to hectares of agroecology. And there's more science we need to do to find that ratio in given contexts. The other advantage to doing a biofloc system in this setting is that we can actually centralize the waste. So that allows us to collect the solids and to collect the sludge and to redirect that into other things as well. We haven't done this part yet, but we anticipate being able to do large composting systems where we can collect the solids and convert that into biofertilizers. That becomes another product we can sell. As well as for the collection of chitin, chitin, which is a very, very high value input to the production of chitosan. Shrimp shells are mostly chitin. And so if we can collect the solid waste, then we can start sorting the chitin from the other waste and creating other outputs.
Like what kind of outputs are created from chitin?
Chitin is, oh goodness. Can I Google it real quick? Because it's used in all kinds of things. But the market for chitin is about 1.8 billion in the US.
Hmm.
And anticipated to reach 6 billion in the early 2030s. And it's used in pharmaceuticals, it's used in cosmetics, it's used in cooking products, it's used in some textiles.
Interesting.
It's used in it has some really pretty amazing properties to it.
Huh.
That make it in high demand, and you can get it from shrimp shells.
Interesting.
So being able to centralize production means we can also centralize waste, which means we can develop processes and methods to extract out of that waste high value things that we can then turn around and process and sell. You can't do that in a pond because it's all diffuse. It's all decentralized. And so that's.
So are you doing some kind of vertical shrimp farming or something to be reducing the area somehow, or?
It's not vertical, it's in tanks.
Okay.
It's in tanks. And biofloc is a well-known methodology for growing shrimp. My partners have a proprietary biofloc system that they've developed over 15, 20 years. And so they partnered with us quite recently, actually.
So this is in the early phases,
Super
right?
early.
Right.
Yeah.
So is there a way for people to get involved if they want to? Is there a way for people to invest if they're interested? Is there something
Yeah.
that you need to be launching this, that, a call out for
So
support?
we're going after grants and investment at the same time.
Okay.
The grants are tailored to specific things we need to do R&D on. We'll be doing SBIR grants next year to try to get some government money in phase 1 of that. But we're also, you're one of the first people I'm talking about this with publicly, but we're in stealth mode right now, and we'll probably be doing a seed raise in January. Probably $4 to $5 million seed raise to build our farm in Texas.
And that's where it's going to start.
Yeah.
Well, so it's really exciting to be able to be exposed to something that is in this phase of development with this much research and this much.
There's decades of buildup behind us on this. It's between Carl's work figuring out that you can grow certain crops with seawater, and figuring out mangrove agroforestry systems, and our aquaculture folks work in developing their systems. There's a lot of experience going into this, but I think it can be very, very disruptive.
That sounds very exciting. So how can people reach you if they have resources to share or are interested in investing?
Yeah, the best way right now is through my website, which is nealspackman.com.
Could you spell for us?
Neal is NEALSPACKMAN.com. You can reach
Great.
me through that or LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And so are there any questions I should have asked you, Neal, that I didn't?
Oh goodness.
We covered a lot of territory.
We've gone very specific on some things. I always like to talk about what regenerative is, and the line of thinking behind it, because it's fundamentally different from how most people approach resource use. And it's one of my soapboxes, but I've also got to go in about 2 minutes. So I think if we want to do a follow-up,
Just give us a minute of regenerative. before we wrap up?
I mean, the foundational thing is that humans are a keystone species,
I love it.
right? A keystone species is a species that the health of an ecology relies on their right behavior, right? So you think of a beaver, right, or a prairie dog, or a mangrove tree in the case of mangroves, right? That these species, all the other species in their ecosystem rely on them, right? And humans are the keystone species that when we are acting according to our potential, we're not destructive, we're actually the linchpin of ecological health. And we have the capacity to be that, and that means we're not trying to be less bad for Earth, which is what everything else is focused on. That we're, if we act in the right way, we can foment the health of ecosystems and biodiversity. And I learned that in a very personal and tangible way in Saudi Arabia, where we saw life come back to a dead place. We saw the whole trophic cascade, starting with the mycelial layer, and then insects came back, and then birds and lizards and mammals came back, and plants started flourishing more and more, and then we eventually saw predators on our site.
Wow.
And we can do that everywhere, in a way that it actually cares for us, in a way that it takes care of our needs, and in a way that it fosters life.
I love it. Thank you. That's a beautiful way to wrap our interview. I so appreciate that, and so appreciate your vision and what you're up to. And I want to say thank you.
Thank you,
And
Neal.
thank you to all of you who are listening and helping to support us through Patreon, and your attendance and your sharing of this information. And I want to thank our my partner in crime here at Sustainability Now, Scott Billy, who's also our producer. And until next time, live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.